Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Wherever you are and whenever you are, welcome to Season 3, Episode 2 of my podcast, The Devil and the Deep Blue Me. And I am your host, Rich Bruck. And if you're just joining us, this season is called What I Know Now, a look at the lessons I'm living today, even knowing that they'll probably shift and evolve by tomorrow. It's about embracing the fact that wisdom isn't a destination you reach, but more like a conversation you keep having with yourself and the world around you. Today's episode is about something I've been wrestling with my whole adult life, the myth of arrival. That seductive idea that someday, somehow, you'll just arrive and have everything all figured out. You'll reach that magical place where you're confident, content, and complete. And unfortunately, it just doesn't work that way. And honestly, I think that is completely by design. I was thinking about this because I just had a birthday recently, and birthdays have this weird way of making you take inventory. Like, okay, where am I supposed to be now? And what should I have figured out? And it hit me how much of my life I've spent waiting for some future version of myself to show up. The one who would have all the answers and who would never second guess himself, who would know exactly what he was doing all the time. But here's what I'm learning. That guy, he ain't coming. Not because I'm broken or behind schedule, but because that's not how any of this actually works. Life isn't a problem you solve once and then you get to relax. It's more like learning to play an instrument. You never really finish learning guitar. You just get better at having conversations with it. So today we're going to talk about why we fall for this arrival myth in the first place, what it costs us when we do, and what life starts to look like when you finally give up waiting for yourself to be done becoming who you are. I was obviously thinking about birthdays this week, not just mine, just the whole concept of them, and how every year used to feel like a checkpoint when I was younger. You know, like at 30, I'll have my shit together. At 40, I'll know exactly who I am. At 50, I'll be dead. No, I'm just, I'll have arrived somewhere that feels like home. I remember my 30th birthday specifically. I was so convinced that crossing that threshold would automatically make me feel more adult, more legitimate, more complete somehow. Like there was this invisible finish line that I was approaching, and once I crossed it, I'd suddenly have access to some secret knowledge about how to be all grown up. Well, the day came and nothing. I woke up feeling exactly how I had felt the day before, except now I was technically in my 30s and still didn't know how to fold a fitted sheet or feel confident in a job interview. It was almost comical, this expectation I had built up versus the reality of just being the same person with a slightly higher number attached to my age. But it wasn't just birthdays. I've done this with everything. Career milestones, relationship markers, creative achievements. When I get that promotion, then I'll feel secure. When I find the right person, then I'll be complete. When I record an album, then I'll be a real musician. Always this when-then thinking. Always this assumption that there was some magical point where the struggling would stop and the knowing would just begin. And the older I get, the clearer it becomes that life isn't a parking spot that you reach and you stay in. It's more like a road trip with lots of scenic detours and construction zones and those moments where you realize you've been driving in the wrong direction for the last hour, but the scenery was just so interesting, you aren't even mad about it. Actually, let me use a musical example because it's easier for me to think about that. When I first started playing guitar, seriously, I'm talking about the transition from just, fooling around to actually trying to be good at it. I had this idea that there was some level that I would reach that I would officially know how to play guitar. Like there was a finish line where I'd cross over from student to expert. And, 20, 30 plus years later, I'm still learning new things about the instrument, and I'm still discovering chords I've never played and still finding ways to get sounds that I didn't know were possible. The guitar keeps teaching me, and I keep being surprised by what I don't know yet. And that's not frustrating anymore. It's kind of, the best part. I think that's what I want to unpack today. This road trip idea. What the arrival myth gets wrong about how growth actually works, and how learning into the ongoingness of life actually makes things kinder, more creative, and way less exhausting than constantly waiting for yourself to be finished. Because I'll be perfectly honest with you, I spent a lot of years feeling like I was behind, like everyone else had gotten some handbook about how to be an adult that I never received. It's still in the mail. And the arrival myth fed right into that anxiety. It kept me focused on some imaginary future where I'd finally catch up instead of paying attention to what was actually happening in life right in front of me. So let's talk about why this myth is so persistent, why it's ultimately unhelpful, and what changes when you start treating your life like an ongoing creative project and instead of a problem you're supposed to solve once and for all. So what exactly is this arrival myth I keep talking about? Well, it's this deeply embedded cultural story that goes something like this. If you work hard enough, achieve enough, heal enough, learn enough, optimize enough, eventually you'll reach this state of being where everything just works, where you're confident without doubt, productive without struggle, and happy without sadness, wise without confusion. This myth gets reinforced everywhere. Self-help books promise that you can fix yourself in 10 easy steps. Motivational speakers sell you on the idea that success is a destination that you'll arrive at. And social media shows you everyone else's highlight reels and makes it seem like they've figured out something that you haven't. Even well-meaning friends and family contribute to it when they ask, "So, when are you going to settle down?" Or, "Don't you want to find your passion?" As if there are final answers to these questions. And I fell for this hard when I was young. I had this checklist mentally about life. Get your degree, check. Find a career, check. Get into the relationship, check. And after each check, I genuinely expected to feel done somehow. Like I'd completed another level in a video game of adulthood and could now relax and enjoy the achievement. But here's the thing. The arrival myth confuses goal completion with permanent transformation. It assumes that external achievements create internal states that last. And maybe more importantly, it treats growth like a linear process with a clear endpoint, when actually growth is seasonal and ongoing. Let me give you a concrete example from my own life. For years, I thought that if I could just get good enough at guitar, confident enough in my playing, I would never feel insecure about my musical abilities ever again. And I practiced obsessively. I learned theory, I developed techniques, and yes, I got better, significantly better. But did the insecurity disappear? No, it just evolved. And now instead of worrying about whether I can play a D chord cleanly, I worry about whether my songwriting is authentic, or whether my arrangements serve the music, whether I'm growing as an artist or just repeating myself. The skills developed, but the edge of growth, that place where you're stretched beyond, what you know, the edge just moved to a new location. And I realize now that this is how it's supposed to work. The edge isn't a bug in the system. It's the feature that keeps you alive, curious, and engaged. When you stop having an edge, when you really do arrive at some final state, that's not mastery, that's stagnation. The arrival myth is seductive because it promises relief from the discomfort of not knowing and from the uncertainty that comes with being human. But when you buy into it, you end up spending most of your life waiting for your real life to begin. You defer satisfaction. You postpone self-acceptance. You treat your current self like a rough draft of the person you're supposed to become. And what I'm learning is that there is no final draft. There's no version of you that's complete and finished and done. There are just different versions, different seasons, different chapters in an ongoing story that doesn't have a conclusion because you're still living it. So, why do we keep falling for this arrival myth when experience keeps showing us that it doesn't really work that way? I think there are a few things going on here. And they're all, pretty understandable when you think about them. First, it's genuinely comforting to believe that there's an endpoint to a struggle. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We like closure. We like resolution. We like stories that have clear beginnings, clear middles, and clear endings. The idea that life is just ongoing with no final resolution can feel pretty overwhelming if you're, not prepared for it. And second, we live in a culture that's obsessed with optimization and completion. Everything is a project to be finished, a problem to be solved, or a goal to be achieved. We have productivity apps that want you to close all your loops, wellness programs that promise to fix you permanently, and career advice that assumes there's one perfect job out there just waiting for you to find it. I do remember reading a self-help book, my one and only self-help book a long time ago. I won't name it, but it was one of those classics that, everyone at the time anyway seemed to be recommending. And the basic premise was that if you just followed their system, did their exercises, changed your mindset, you could essentially graduate from personal growth. Like if you do the work once, you'd be done and free to enjoy your perfectly optimized life. And I followed that system religiously for about 6 months. I journaled every day, did the affirmations, restructured my habits, and some of it was, genuinely helpful. I did develop better routines and clearer goals, but then life happened. I got kicked out of a band, and I was in a relationship that ended unexpectedly, and then my dad got sick and ended up in the hospital, and suddenly all that certainty I thought I'd built, well, it just evaporated. And that's when I started to realize that resilience isn't about building a life so perfect that nothing can shake it. It's about getting better at dancing with uncertainty and staying curious when things don't go according to plan, at finding your footing again when the ground shifts under you. There's also this thing where we confuse progress with completion. When you're learning something new, whether it's a skill or a way of being in the world, there are these moments of breakthrough where everything suddenly clicks and you have a great day, a successful interaction, a moment of clarity, and it feels like you've finally got it. Like when you're learning a difficult song and you finally nail it once. That moment feels amazing, like you've conquered the piece, like you've arrived at mastery. But then you try to play it the next day and you fumble parts you thought you had down. The competence isn't gone, but it's not quite as stable as you thought it was. And the same thing happens with life skills. You have a period where you're really good at setting boundaries and you think, great, I've figured out boundaries. And then someone pushes in just the right way and you find yourself saying yes when you meant to say no. It doesn't mean that you didn't learn anything. It just means learning is more of a spiral than a straight line. I think the deepest reason we fall for the arrival myth is that it offers an escape from the fundamental uncertainty of being human. It promises that if we just do enough work on ourselves, we can transcend the basic condition of not knowing what's coming next, of not having all the answers, of sometimes feeling lost or confused or overwhelmed. But here's the thing. The people I admire most, the ones who seem most at peace with themselves and most effective in the world, they're not the ones who have everything figured out. They're they're the ones who've gotten good at not knowing, who made friends with uncertainty, and who learned to surf the waves instead of trying to stop the ocean. So what do I know now about all of this? And what have I learned from decades of chasing arrivals that never quite materialized the way that I expected them to? Well, first, I know that growth is seasonal, not linear. There are times when you're expanding, learning rapidly, making visible progress, and there are times when you're integrating, resting, or even seeming to go backwards. Both phases are necessary, and neither one is the final state. I went through a period a few years ago where I really felt like I was regressing in a lot of areas. I was more anxious than I'd been in years, and second-guessing decisions I thought I'd made peace with, feeling uncertain about creative directions that had seemed, pretty clear before. And according to the arrival myth, this was evidence that I was failing, that all my previous growth had been fake or temporary. But what I realized was that I was actually in a deepening phase. The anxiety wasn't random. It was showing me places where I had been operating from old assumptions, and they no longer served me. The uncertainty wasn't chaos. It was my system's way of making room for new ways of being that were trying to emerge. And what I know now is that when you hit a milestone, when you complete a project or reach a goal or have a breakthrough, give yourself a moment to acknowledge it, celebrate it, and let it register. But then get curious about what wants to emerge next, because the milestone isn't an endpoint. It's a platform that you're standing on to see further. This has completely changed how I approach creative projects. I used to think that finishing a song meant that I was done with it, that recording an album meant I'd said everything I had to say in that particular way. But now I see each creative project as part of an ongoing conversation I'm having with my own artistic development. That song that I mentioned in the last episode, Halfway Home, I rewrote it completely years after I thought it was finished. But the rewrite wasn't a rejection of the original version. It was a continuation of the conversation I'd started with that song, informed now by life that I'd lived and the skills I'd developed since the first draft. And the same thing applies to how I think about relationships or career moves, even personal patterns. Instead of asking, am I done working on this? I try to ask, what's the next edge here? What wants to evolve? What am I ready to experiment with now? And here's what's been surprisingly liberating about giving up the arrival myth. It takes so much pressure off. When you're not expecting yourself to be finished, when you're not comparing your current state to some imaginary perfect version of yourself, you can actually pay attention to what's happening right in front of you. Practically speaking, this means I've gotten much better at treating setbacks as information rather than failures. And when I slip back into an old pattern I thought I had outgrown, instead of beating myself up about not being further along, I just get curious. What was happening that triggered the old response? What might I need that I'm not really giving myself? What's the next small experiment that I could try? And the aim isn't to reach some mythical finish line where you never struggle or never doubt yourself and never face uncertainty. The aim is to get better at being curious about the next edit of yourself, to develop more skill at navigating the ongoing process of becoming who you are. Because here's really what I've discovered, that the people who seem most at peace aren't the ones who have everything figured out. They're the ones who've made friends with not knowing and who have learned to find stability in the change itself and who treat their lives like an ongoing creative project rather than a problem to be solved once and for all. Let me tell you about a specific moment when this all became crystal clear for me. It was a few years ago, and I'd been working toward what felt like the biggest milestone of my life at that point, recording my first real album. Not just demos or rough recordings, but a proper, professionally produced album with original songs that I'd been working on. And I had this very specific fantasy about what it would feel like when the album was finished. I thought, this is it. This is when I'll finally be able to call myself a real musician without any qualifiers, without any imposter syndrome, without any doubt as to whether I belong in this world. And the album was going to be my arrival certificate. And the recording process was everything I'd hoped for, challenging and genuinely satisfying creative work. And when it was finally finished, when I had the thing done in my hands for the first time, it was absolutely a peak moment. I felt proud and accomplished, like I'd crossed a threshold that I'd been working toward for years. But here's what nobody tells you about reaching your big milestone. The feeling lasts about a week, maybe 2 if you're lucky, and then real life reasserts itself, and you realize that recording an album doesn't magically transform you into someone who never doubts their musical abilities ever again. Within a month, I was dealing with completely new questions that I hadn't even known existed when I was focused on just finishing the album. How do you promote music without feeling like a used car salesman? How do you get people to actually listen to it? How do you, book your own shows as opposed to cover bands? And how do you connect with an audience when it's your own stuff and not, just covers that they already know? And underneath all of those practical questions was a deeper one. Now what? And that's when I realized that the milestone had changed the map, but it hadn't erased the map. I wasn't done being a musician. I was just starting a new phase of being a musician. The album wasn't my graduation from uncertainty. It was my enrollment in a completely different kind of uncertainty. And once I started paying attention, I realized this pattern was everywhere in my life. But here's what was actually beautiful about this realization. It took all the pressure off that one album to be perfect, to say everything, to prove everything. Because it wasn't my final statement. It was just the next sentence in an ongoing conversation I was having with my own creativity. Now when I finish a song or a project, I still celebrate it. I still feel proud of the work, but I also stay curious about what it's teaching me, what it's opening up, and what wants to emerge next. The completion is very real, but it's not final. It's just another beginning, disguised as an ending. So here's what I want you to take away from all this rambling about arrivals and milestones and the ongoing nature of becoming who you are. First of all, treat your milestones as checkpoints, not finish lines. When you reach a goal, complete a project, have a breakthrough, absolutely celebrate it. Let yourself feel the satisfaction, acknowledge the growth, and appreciate how far you've come, but then stay curious about what wants to emerge next, because the milestone isn't the end of your story. It's just the end of that particular chapter. And secondly, stop expecting yourself to be done growing, done changing, done learning, done struggling with certain things. The version of you that has everything figured out isn't running late. That version doesn't exist. And that's actually good news. It means you get to keep becoming, keep discovering, keep surprising yourself with what you're really capable of. And finally, when you catch yourself waiting for your real life to begin, waiting until you're more confident, more successful, more healed, more whatever it is, that's your cue to pay attention to what's actually happening in your life right now. Because this is your real life. This uncertainty, this in-betweenness, this sense of still figuring things out, this isn't the waiting room before your life begins. This is your life. And here's what I find most liberating about this perspective. It makes life so much less crushing. When you're not expecting yourself to arrive anywhere final, when you're not measuring your worth against some impossible standard of completion, you can actually enjoy the process. You can be curious about your mistakes instead of ashamed of them. And you can see setbacks as plot twists instead of evidence that you're failing. It also makes life way more creative, more open-ended in the best possible way. Instead of trying to solve yourself like a math problem, you get to approach yourself like an ongoing art project. And art projects don't have to be perfect. They just have to be honest, interesting, and alive to what's trying to emerge. So, if you are one of these people, like so many of us, feeling that you're, falling behind, if you're wondering when you're finally going to have your shit together, if you're frustrated that you're still working on things that you thought you'd figured out years ago, well, welcome to being human. You're not broken. You're not behind schedule, and you're definitely not alone. You're just still becoming, and that's exactly where you're supposed to be. All right. And now it is time for this week's enrichment segment, where we dive into some fascinating facts that might shift your perspective, or at least give you something interesting to think about. Did you know that butterflies taste with their feet? They have chemoreceptors on their legs that can help them identify suitable plants for laying eggs. They literally have to land on something to know if it's, what they're looking for. And there is something beautifully metaphorical about that. Sometimes you can't know if something is right for you until you actually step into it, until you make contact. All the research and planning in the world can't replace the direct experience of testing the ground that you're standing on. Here's another one. Sharks have been around for about 400 million years, but they have never stopped evolving. They survived multiple mass extinctions, not by staying the same, but by continuously adapting. What we call a shark today is actually hundreds of different species that have all found different ways to thrive in different environments. And that gives me hope, honestly. Survival isn't about reaching some perfect form and maintaining it. It's about staying responsive to the changing conditions and about being willing to adapt while keeping your essential nature intact. Maybe resilience isn't about building armor. Maybe it's about staying flexible. And then I think this is my favorite one for today. Trees don't actually stop growing until they die. Even a 2,000-year-old tree is still adding new rings, still reaching toward light, still responding to the seasons. The growth might slow down, but it never completely stops. Kind of puts our human timeline into perspective. When we get so anxious about not being done, growing by 30, 40, 50, but maybe continuous growth isn't a sign that we're behind. Maybe it's a sign that we're alive. So from butterfly feet to ancient sharks to millennial trees, nature keeps showing us that adaptability and ongoing growth aren't bugs in the system, they're just features. And maybe it's time we started seeing them that way in our own lives as well. And just a quick music update before we wrap up today. And it actually connects perfectly to what I've been talking about. I've been working on this piece I'm calling Draft in Progress at the moment. It started as a simple little finger-picking pattern, something I was just messing around with during a little break between lessons. And then I started adding layers, a harmony line that weaves in and out of the main melody and some subtle percussion with my palm hitting the guitar body and this little bass note that shouldn't work, but somehow it anchors the whole thing together. And what's interesting is that I keep thinking I'm done with it, and then I'll be playing it and discover some new possibilities, some variation that opens up a whole different direction. And it's become this perfect example of what I've been talking about, how creative work, like life, doesn't really have a final version. Each time I think I've completed the arrangement, it teaches me something new about what it wants to become. And I'm learning to love that process instead of being frustrated by it. I'm actually thinking about sharing some of these works in progress this season instead of waiting till I think they're done. There's something vulnerable about letting people hear the rough edges and, the places where I'm still figuring things out. But there's also something pretty honest about it that feels more real than only sharing the polished, final version. If you want to hear more of my musical experiments, including, some of the stuff that I'm talking about, you can always find my links on Spotify or Apple or YouTube if that's where you are. Incidentally, if that's where you are, please subscribe and give me a like because it it helps more than you know, especially for a guy who's still trying to figure out how social media works. This beautiful thing about music is that it's always been about process over product. Even when you record a final version of a song, every time you play it live, it's just slightly different. And maybe that's what drew me to music in the first place. I don't know. It's an art form that's comfortable with being perpetually unfinished. So that's episode 2, and a deep dive into why we never really arrive anywhere final, and why that's actually better news than it might seem at first. We talked about the arrival myth, this persistent story that somewhere out there is a version of yourself that has everything all figured out. And we've explored why this myth is so seductive and why it ultimately doesn't really serve us. And we looked at what life starts to look like when you treat it as an ongoing creative project instead of a problem to solve once and for all. And recording this episode, I'm quite aware of how much I'm still figuring out my own relationship to this stuff. Part of me wants to have it all wrapped up in this neat little conclusion and wants to sound like I've transcended the arrival myth completely. But the truth is, I still catch myself sometimes waiting for some future version of myself to show up. And I still sometimes treat my current struggles like temporary inconveniences before I finally get my act together. And I think that's okay. Maybe the goal isn't to eliminate these patterns, but to catch them more quickly and to, laugh at them a little. To remember that they're just part of the human operating system trying to make sense of an inherently uncertain world. And I would love to hear from you about your own experiences with arrival fantasies. What milestones did you think would fix everything? What happened after you got there? Did it change the questions you were asking, even if it didn't answer them permanently? Send me a message, leave me a comment, or just think about it during your commute. Sometimes the most valuable conversations are the ones we have with ourselves. I think that's why I do the podcast. But here's what I want you to remember as you go back into your week. You're not behind. You're not taking too long to figure things out. You're not supposed to be done growing or done changing or done discovering new things about yourself and the world. The fact that you're still becoming isn't evidence that you're broken. It's actually evidence that you're alive. Life isn't a parking spot you finally reach after a long, difficult journey. It's more like a scenic road trip where the destination keeps changing. And that's not a bug. That's the point. The journey is the thing. And you're exactly where you need to be, even when you can't see around the next curve. So keep driving, keep looking around, keep being curious about what's coming next. And while you're doing that, please have yourself a safe and happy week.